Over the course of the Education for All period, there's been a major expansion in enrollments in government school systems, but at the same time there's been a major move towards private schooling in the same countries. And there has been major growth in certain countries, for example in Ghana and Nigeria, Kenya, India and Pakistan. And most of this growth has happened completely spontaneously without any interference from outside. And now it's gotten to the point where to look at an education system in several contexts in these countries means really to look at both the government and the private sector. For example, there's been a lot of research and emphasis on Lagos State in Nigeria, but Enugu State, which is less well known in the same country, now has 36% of its enrollments in the private sector, and this has happened with no focus from outside, with no support or development aid in that direction. At the same time, in certain contexts where it seems like the circumstances are ripe for private sector development, it hasn't really taken off. For example, I've done recent research in Maputo and Dar es Salaam, where we found that even with very much failing government school quality, low-fee private schools really aren't taking off. And the only clear explanation that can be found is the fact that people simply can't afford to pay for low-fee private schooling. The merits and the downsides of low-fee private schooling are hotly contested in the literature. Key reasons for the controversy are the fact that the world has been moving towards a clear acceptance that especially the lower levels of education should be fee-free for all, and that education is really a human right, so inability to pay should not be a barrier. It's simply not considered right that the poor should be paying for pre-primary and primary levels of education, which are the levels that the poor have the most interaction with. To have to pay for such levels increases stratification in society and even can lead to the ghettoization of government school systems when all of the wealthier families tend to leave for the private sector, leaving just the poorest and the most voiceless behind. Some suggest that private schooling is a pro-poor solution from the poor for the poor, that it's providing a better quality of education and that it's more innovative and more flexible than government schooling. However, on the other side, critics point to the poor physical conditions in private schools. They say that the quality of provision is actually not that good, and that they actually are exploiting the families that use them, as well as the teachers that they pay quite low wages to, and in particular female teachers who are often paid much less. Even the quality of the provision available in low-fee private schools is still debated, with some stating that it's clearly better quality, while others find that once you control sufficiently for the background characteristics of these children, that the private school advantage all but disappears. Private school infrastructure is very often much worse than government school infrastructure. However, the schools are often much smaller. It's much less likely for a child to get lost in the shuffle of a large, overcrowded classroom. The schools are closer to home, and so parents just feel better and more secure in that their children are probably being taken care of better. So proponents of private schooling in developing countries suggest that they can play a very substantial and positive role, and that competition between private schools and between private and government schools will actually result in an upward pressure on standards across the board, including in government schools. And in certain contexts, it's absolutely the case that government provision simply has not kept pace in any way with the demands. So, for example, in Lagos and Nairobi, things have developed to the point where the government can never become the majority provider again. Therefore, the government really should be finding positive and constructive ways to work with the private sector in those contexts. So basically we can say that the private sector is serving a large number of children, whether we like it or not. and it wouldn't be right or fair to try and stop parents from using low-fee private schools when they're really just trying to provide the best for their children. The point needs to be made, however, that low-fee private schooling is not a solution to wider education problems. They will not drive up standards across the board because competition theory simply doesn't work as it should in practice. They won't bring out-of-school children into school, and they won't serve remote rural areas because private schools only go where there is a market for them. So therefore you have to have populations that are sufficiently dense and that have sufficient income to pay the fees. Donors should be focusing their efforts on reaching the very poorest, and low-fee private schooling simply doesn't do this. There are indications from the voucher program being tried in Pakistan that the very poorest don't even access private schooling where a voucher scheme is in operation. The key focus and drive should remain on improving government schools, which is also a good way to improve standards in private schools, because private schools have to remain at least a couple of steps ahead of the government system in order to justify the fees paid to them. There's really no point in spending scarce government resources or donor funding on trying to stimulate private school markets or to make them change drastically, or on promoting international chain school operations in these contexts where private schooling is already playing a major role. However, technical assistance to help governments to work better with the private sector in the contexts where it's already thriving and where it's playing an enormous and possibly even a majority role, that kind of donor support is positive and useful and should be encouraged. And the key focus should really be, however, on improving the quality of government school systems, because only they will reach truly remote rural areas, they will reach the poorest, and they will also ensure that private schools are improving along with government provision, because they have to stay ahead of the government sector.